In 1989, Mark Davis looked like he had found the role he was born to play. A left-handed closer in San Diego, he saved 44 games, posted a 1.85 ERA, made the All-Star team, and won the National League Cy Young Award. For one season, the ninth inning belonged to him, and it did not feel like a fluke. Davis had been a teenage major leaguer, a former first-round pick, a pitcher with enough talent to survive trades, reinvention, and a hard early turn as a starter. By the end of that summer, it seemed like everything had finally lined up. Then came free agency, a new contract, a new city. And somehow, the closer who stood on top of the league never really got back there again. In 1989, Mark Davis was the pitcher nobody in the National League wanted to see coming through the bullpen gate. He was left-handed, 6'3", lean, and by that summer in San Diego, he had become something more than a good reliever. He had become a kind of ending. The Padres would get the ball to the ninth inning. Davis would take it, and for a few months, baseball treated that like a closed door. 44 saves, a 1.85 ERA, 65 games finished, an All-Star appearance, 6th place in the National League MVP vote, and then, at the end of it, the National League Cy Young Award. Not a token vote, not a sentimental award. Mark Davis won it. He received 89% of the Cy Young share, and for that one season, the writers looked across the league and decided that the most valuable pitcher in the National League was a closer in San Diego. That matters, because closers did not win Cy Young Awards very often. Davis was only the 4th reliever to do it, and in the National League, it would not happen again until Eric Garnet in 2003. So if you were watching baseball in the late 1980s, especially on the West Coast, Mark Davis was not some footnote. He was not a trivia answer yet. He was the guy with the save total, the guy who turned late leads into handshakes. But baseball history has a strange way of thinning out certain careers. Some players are remembered because they lasted forever, some because they won in October, some because they became larger than the teams they played for. And then there are players like Mark Davis.
A man who reached the top of his profession, won one of the sport's major awards, signed one of the biggest contracts of his era for a reliever, and then, almost before the story could settle, was no longer that same pitcher in the public imagination. Over the final 8 seasons of his career, after that Cy Young year, he recorded only 11 saves. 11. That is the part that stops you, because it does not sound like the same player. It sounds like 2 careers that somehow share the same name. And that is where the real story begins. Not with a birth date, not with a high school scouting report, not with the usual road through the minors. It begins with a question that only baseball can ask this quietly. How can a pitcher be the best in the league one year and then spend the rest of his career trying to get back to a role that had already moved on without him? The answer is not simple. It is not one pitch, one injury, one headline, or one easy explanation. It is a story about role, timing, trust, contracts, bullpens, and how a reliever's greatness can be real and still fragile. Because in 1989, Mark Davis did not look like a player about to fade. He looked like a man who had finally arrived. The Padres had already seen the warning signs in 1988, but they were the good kind. Davis became their closer that season and saved 28 games. He made the All-Star team. He gave San Diego the kind of left-handed late-inning presence every club wants and almost no club can easily find. Relief pitching was changing in those years. The closer was becoming more defined, more specialized, more central to the shape of a modern bullpen. The 9th inning was becoming its own job, with its own pressure and its own reputation. And Davis, after years of trying to find his place, fit there. Then came 1989. That season did not just raise his profile, it changed the way people had to talk about him. 44 saves led the National League.
65 games finished led the league too. His ERA stayed at 1.85, the kind of number that gives a closer an aura. Every appearance has danger built into it, because relievers usually enter when the game is already tense. One bad pitch can turn a clean season into a scar. But Davis kept answering.
The most telling stretch came late, when the season was grinding down and every inning carried more weight. In the final month, he threw 25 innings and did not allow any of the 19 runners he inherited to score. That is not just good pitching. That is pressure converted into silence. Inherited runners are a different kind of statistic. They tell you a pitcher did not always get a clean inning. He did not always get the luxury of starting fresh. Sometimes he came in with somebody else's mess on the bases, with the crowd already awake, with the tying run already in motion. And in that final month, nobody he inherited crossed the plate. For fans who remember baseball before every game was clipped, shared, and archived on demand, seasons like that lived in a different way. You followed them through box scores, local broadcasts, late-night highlights, the morning paper, and the feeling that certain names just kept showing up in the same place. Mark Davis, save. Mark Davis, game finished. Mark Davis, another 0. That kind of season builds its own momentum. It becomes part of the summer. It makes a pitcher feel inevitable. And yet, even inside that dominance, there was something easy to miss at the time. Davis was a closer, and closers live in a narrow room. Their reputations can grow faster than almost anyone's, but they can also turn faster. A starting pitcher can have a rough inning and still work 6. A hitter can go 0 for 4 and play again tomorrow, with less of the game attached to his name. A closer comes in when the story is almost written. If he finishes it, people nod. If he does not, everyone remembers. In 1989, Davis finished it better than anyone in his league. The Cy Young confirmed what San Diego had watched all year, but it also created a new version of him, a public version, an expensive version, a version that would be measured against the cleanest season of his life. And that is the hard thing about a peak. You do not know it is a peak when you are standing on it. To understand why the fall-off feels so abrupt, you have to understand that Davis had already changed careers once before. The pitcher who became a Cy Young closer was not developed from the beginning as a one-inning specialist.
He had been a prospect, a young arm, a starter, a trade piece, and for a while, a pitcher trying to survive the hardest part of the major leagues, proving where he belonged. Mark William Davis was born October 19, 1960, in Livermore, California. He threw left-handed and batted left-handed. That alone gives a pitcher extra chances in baseball, but it does not give him a career. He still had to find the role that fit. The Mets drafted him in the 22nd round of the 1978 amateur draft out of Granada High School in Livermore, but he did not sign. The next year, after Shabot College in Haywood, the Phillies took him with the first pick of the 1979 January secondary draft. That is a very different kind of signal. A 22nd round pick can be a flyer. A first overall pick in that phase tells you an organization saw something real. The Phillies were not bringing in a finished product. They were betting on a young left-hander with enough promise to move quickly. And he did move quickly. On September 12, 1980, Mark Davis made his major league debut at 19 years old. 19. He faced the St. Louis Cardinals and threw 2 innings. No hits, 1 strikeout, 1 walk, no earned runs. It is the kind of debut that can look small on a career page, just 1 line in September. But it says something about how early the game opened the door for him. At an age when most pitchers are still years away from figuring out professional hitters, Davis had already reached the majors. But early arrival does not guarantee a straight road. He spent parts of 1980 and 1981 with Philadelphia,
And then, in December of 1982, his career was redirected by one of those trades that looks like a time capsule of early 1980s baseball. The Phillies sent Davis, Mike Krukow, and minor leaguer C.L. Penniger to the San Francisco Giants for Joe Morgan and Al Holland. Even if Davis was not the headliner, that kind of deal places a young pitcher inside serious baseball traffic. Joe Morgan was a Hall of Fame name. Al Holland was a high-end reliever. Krukow would become a familiar giant. Davis was part of a transaction that connected past, present, and future all at once. San Francisco gave him a longer look, and in 1984, the Giants gave him the ball as a starter. He started a career-high 27 games that year.
The record was .517. He allowed 104 earned runs, the most in the National League. His 17 losses ranked second. He gave up 25 home runs, fifth in the league. Those numbers are hard. They are also easy to flatten into a judgment, which would miss the point. A young pitcher in a starting role on a struggling path is not always failing in the way the record says. Sometimes he is learning in public. Sometimes he is being asked to become something he is not going to become. But the standings do not wait for a pitcher to find himself. The league does not soften because you are left-handed or young or once drafted high. Hitters adjust. Ballparks punish mistakes. Managers need outs. Davis's future as a starter began to narrow. And that is where his career becomes more interesting, not less. Because many pitchers reach that point and drift. Davis did not. By the next season, he was becoming primarily a reliever. The role changed, and with it, the possibility of a different career. That shift mattered. It took him away from the long burden of turning over a lineup 3 times, and moved him towards shorter, sharper work. It also began the slow process of revealing what he might be best suited to do. Still, even then, he was not yet Mark Davis, Cy Young closer. He was a left-hander trying to become valuable in a new way. And the team that would unlock that value was not San Francisco. It was San Diego. On July 5, 1987, the Giants and Padres made a trade that would alter several careers, and, for Davis, change the meaning of his. San Francisco sent Mark Davis, Chris Brown, Keith Comstock, and Mark Grant to San Diego. In return, the Giants received Dave Dravecky, Craig Lefferts, and Kevin Mitchell. If you watched the National League in the 1980s, those names have weight. Dravecky, Lefferts, Mitchell, Padres and Giants. A mid-season trade with real players, real consequences, and the particular urgency of clubs trying to reshape themselves while the season is still alive. For Davis, it was the move that put him in the right bullpen at the right time. That phrase can sound too neat, but baseball careers often turn on exactly that. Not just talent, not just health, not just opportunity. The right organization has to see the right use for the right pitcher at the right moment. In San Diego, Davis began to become the pitcher people would remember. He had already moved to relief in San Francisco, but with the Padres, the role sharpened. By 1988, he was the closer. The 9th inning belonged to him. And once that happened, his career finally had a shape that made sense. There is something almost cinematic about a pitcher finding his identity later than expected. Not late in life, but late in baseball terms. Davis had debuted at 19. He had been a starter. He had lost 17 games in a season. He had been traded twice. He had been part of deals involving famous names, but he was still trying to define his own. Then San Diego gave him the 9th, and suddenly the old numbers did not control the story. A .517 season as a starter did not vanish, but it no longer explained him. The earned runs, the home runs, the losses, all of that became background. What mattered now was whether he could protect a lead with the game already tight and the margin already thin. In 1988, he showed he could. 28 saves, an all-star selection, a new reputation.
That season is important because it keeps 1989 from feeling like lightning out of nowhere. Davis did not simply appear, dominate, and disappear. There was a build. There was a conversion. There was evidence that the Padres had found something sustainable. But baseball is always asking the next question. Can you do it again? Can you do it when the league has seen you? Can you do it when the job is no longer an opportunity, but an expectation? For Mark Davis, the answer in 1989 was yes. And not just yes. Yes at the highest level of the league. The closer's job can look simple from a distance. Come in, throw strikes, get 3 outs. But the 9th inning is never only 3 outs. It is the weight of the 8 innings before it. It is the starter watching from the bench. It is the manager's decision being tested in real time. It is the tying run getting 1 swing. It is the difference between a clean box score and a clubhouse that sits with a loss it thought it had avoided. Davis took that responsibility and turned it into the best season of his career. The saves tell one part of it. 44 was enough to lead the National League, and saves still carried enormous public meaning in 1989.
They were printed, discussed, compared. A big save total made a closer visible in a way that advanced bullpen metrics had not yet complicated for the average fan. But the deeper measures support the memory. Davis produced 4.4 WAR as a pitcher that season, 8th in the National League. He led the league in win probability added at 5.8. That matters because it tells you what the eye test already knew. He was pitching in moments that moved games, not empty innings, not soft landings. Leverage. The kind of innings where one batter can change the whole night. That is why the Cy Young vote did not come from nowhere. It came from a season where Davis was not just accumulating saves, he was shaping outcomes. And for a reliever, that is the whole argument. The Padres were not a dynasty. Davis was not protected by the mythology of October. His season had to stand inside the regular summer grind, where only the people paying close attention fully understand how often a man is being asked to hold the line. By the end, the writers saw enough. The 1989 National League Cy Young Award went to Mark Davis. There is a kind of beauty in that, because it captures a baseball truth the sport sometimes forgets. Greatness does not always last 10 years. Sometimes it lasts 1 season. Sometimes it lasts long enough to be undeniable, then slips away before history knows where to put it. For Davis, the award should have been the beginning of a new tier of career. He was 28 years old during that 1989 season. He was an all-star closer. He had just led the league in saves. He had just won the Cy Young. He had entered the small class of relievers whose best season was so strong that voters put them above every starter in the league. That is not usually the end of a story. That is usually where the biggest story starts. And in a way, it did. Because after 1989, Mark Davis was no longer just a pitcher who had found himself in San Diego. He was a prize. He was a free agent. And the same season that made him unforgettable also placed a new kind of weight on every inning that came next. On November 13th, 1989, Mark Davis was granted free agency. Less than a month later, on December 11th, he signed with the Kansas City Royals. The reported number was $13 million. For a pitcher coming off a Cy Young season, it was the reward that made sense. For a reliever in that era, it also changed the frame around him. In San Diego, Davis had become a story because he kept closing games. In Kansas City, he arrived already carrying the story with him. That is a different job. His listed salary had been $600,000 with the Padres in 1989. In 1990, with the Royals, it was $2,125,000. By 1991 and 1992, it was listed at $3,625,000 per season. Those numbers matter because baseball in 1990 was not baseball today. Contracts were smaller, relievers were still fighting for the way the industry valued them,
And when a closer got paid like a star, the ninth inning became more than a baseball role. It became a public accounting. Every save chance felt connected to the contract. Every bad outing carried a headline. Every comparison to the year before was waiting before he even threw a pitch. And that is where the story turns. Davis pitched ineffectively early in the 1990 season, and the Royals eventually moved the closer role to Jeff Montgomery. There is no need to dress that up. That is what happened. The man who had just won the National League Cy Young Award was no longer closing games for his new team. Baseball can be cruel in its simplicity. One year you are the answer. The next year, the club has to find another answer. But it would be too easy and too unfair to turn that into a neat little fall. Davis did not disappear from the major leagues after Kansas City took the ninth inning away. He kept pitching. He kept getting chances. He remained a major league arm. The change was more subtle than a disappearance. It was an identity shift. Because once a closer loses that job, especially after a season like 1989, every new role feels like a comparison to the old one. Middle relief is judged against the ninth. A setup appearance is judged against the save. A clean inning is useful, but it does not restore the image people still have in their heads. And for Davis, that image was unusually bright. 44 saves, Cy Young, All-Star, the best reliever in the National League. That was the shadow he had to pitch beneath. The record does not hand us one clean explanation.
It does not point to one dramatic moment and say, here, this is where it all changed. That is part of what makes the career feel so human. Sometimes baseball careers do not break with a sound. Sometimes they just begin to move differently. And by the time everyone notices, the old version is gone. Davis spent 3 seasons with Kansas City, from 1990 into 1992. The Royals had signed the Cy Young winner, but the dominant San Diego closer did not fully reappear. Jeff Montgomery became the more stable ninth-inning answer. Davis was still there, still working, still part of the staff, but the role that had made him famous had slipped away. And then came the movement that often follows a player whose public peak is already behind him. On July 21, 1992, Kansas City traded Davis to the Atlanta Braves for Juan Berenga. That sentence carries its own quiet context. The Braves of the early 1990s were becoming something different, something larger, a franchise moving into contention and building an era around pitching. Davis arrived there not as the centerpiece of his old story, but as a veteran arm being given another look. It was brief. In April of 1993, Atlanta traded him back to the Philadelphia Phillies for minor leaguer Brad Hassinger. Philadelphia was where Davis had started, the organization that had drafted him first overall in the January secondary phase, the team that had brought him to the majors as a teenager. There is always a strange feeling when a player returns to the first uniform. It can look like a circle closing, or like a chance to begin again. But that return did not last long either. The Phillies released him on July 2nd, 1993. 8 days later, on July 10th, he signed with the San Diego Padres. That name still had meaning. San Diego was where everything had worked. San Diego was where he became an all-star, where he saved 28 games, then 44, where the Cy Young season happened. If there was a place where the old Mark Davis could be easiest to remember, it was there. But memory does not throw pitches. He pitched again for the Padres in 1993 and 1994. Then, on May 24, 1994, San Diego released him. By then, the baseball card version of the career had become complicated. Phillies, Giants, Padres, Royals, Braves, Phillies again, Padres again. A Cy Young Award in the middle, surrounded by trades, releases, changing jobs, and a long attempt to remain useful in a sport that keeps measuring players against who they used to be. After 1994, he was out of the majors for 2 years.
That is another quiet part of the story. Not a headline, not a clean ending, just absence. In 1995, he signed as a free agent with the Florida Marlins. He was granted free agency that October. In December, he signed with Florida again. In March of 1996, the Marlins released him. Those transactions sit on a page like administrative details, but behind them is the part of a career fans rarely see clearly. The work of trying to get back. The phone calls. The spring training look. The roster decision. The veteran left-hander hoping there is still a place. There was still one more Major League chapter. On February 7, 1997, Davis signed with the Arizona Diamondbacks. The Diamondbacks had not yet played a Major League game, but as an expansion organization, they were already assembling players, depth, and options. In August of that year, he was sent to the Milwaukee Brewers as part of a conditional deal. And with Milwaukee, Mark Davis returned to the majors. His last big league game came on September 28, 1997, against Baltimore. 2/3 of an inning, no hits, 1 strikeout, no walks, no earned runs. There is something graceful about that final line. It was not a famous ending. It did not come with ceremonies or a last standing ovation burned into baseball memory. But the final appearance itself was clean. A left-handed pitcher, 36 years old, still getting outs in the major leagues 17 years after he first appeared as a teenager. That matters, because careers are not only made of peaks, they are made of the years after the peak too, when the applause is thinner and the role is smaller, and the player is still trying to do the job. Mark Davis last played in 1997. He finished with 15 major league seasons, 624 games pitched, a 51-84 record, a 4.17 ERA, 96 saves, and 1,007 strikeouts. Those numbers do not tell one simple story. The 51-84 record points back to the years when he started and struggled. The 96 saves point to the closer he became, but also to how short that elite window was. The 624 games remind you he lasted.
The 1,007 strikeouts remind you the arm was real. The 4.17 ERA puts the whole uneven career into one number, which is useful but incomplete. That is the problem with a career like his. If you only look at the Cy Young Award, you miss how hard the rest of the road became. If you only look at the career totals, you miss how high he actually climbed. And if you only remember the contract with Kansas City, you risk turning a full baseball life into a financial footnote. Davis appeared on the 2003 Hall of Fame ballot and received 0.2% of the vote. He was not elected, and the broader Hall of Fame measures were never close to the usual standards. His career WAR is listed at 8.0, with a 7-year peak WAR of 12.0 and a Jaws figure of 10.0 for relief pitchers. That is not a Hall of Fame case. But it was never really the point. The point is that for one season, Mark Davis reached a level that almost nobody in his role ever reaches. The Hall of Fame is built for careers that echo across decades. Davis's strongest claim on memory is different. It is a season, a role, a summer when the 9th inning in San Diego belonged to him, and the rest of the league had to live with it. Baseball history is not always fair to players like that. It remembers the long reigns. It remembers the October heroes. It remembers the men with 300 wins, 500 home runs, 3,000 hits, the names that do not need explanation. But the sport is also made of shorter bursts of greatness, players who were, for a moment, exactly what their team needed and exactly what the league could not solve. That kind of greatness is easier to misplace.
especially for a reliever. A closer's career is measured in trust, and trust can be more fragile than talent. Managers trust the pitcher until they cannot. Fans trust the ninth inning until 1 or 2 games teach them to hold their breath again. Front offices trust the contract until performance forces another plan. Davis lived inside that reality. He had been a starter, then a reliever, then a closer, then a Cy Young winner, then a high-priced free agent, then a pitcher trying to reclaim a place in bullpens around the league. That is not a straight line. It is a career that kept changing shape. And maybe that is why he fits this kind of baseball story so well.
Not because he failed, because he did not fit neatly into the category that fans prefer. He was not a long-term superstar. He was not a one-month wonder. He was not a prospect who vanished. He was not a journeyman who never had a peak. He was all of those things, depending on where you pause the tape. Pause it in 1980, and he is a 19-year-old Phillies left-hander throwing 2 hitless innings in his debut. Pause it in 1984, and he is a Giants starter, taking losses in a hard season. Pause it in 1987, and he is part of a significant Padres-Giants trade still being reshaped. Pause it in 1989, and he is the best pitcher in the National League. Pause it in 1990, and he is the expensive free agent who loses the closer job. Pause it in 1997, and he is a Milwaukee Brewer nearing the end, still recording outs. All of those versions are true. That is what makes the career worth revisiting. Not the clean rise and fall, but the way the same player can carry so many different meanings depending on the year, the uniform, and the expectation around him. After his playing career, Davis stayed in baseball. He spent time on the Arizona Diamondbacks staff, serving as bullpen coach in 2003 and 2004 and pitching coach in 2005. Later, he worked in the Kansas City Royals organization. From 2006 to 2007, he was the pitching coach for the Arizona League Royals. In October of 2010, he was promoted to minor league pitching coordinator. After the 2011 season, he stepped aside from that coordinator role to coach a short-season affiliate in 2012. That part of the story should not be treated as an afterthought. For many former players, staying in the game is its own kind of testimony. The uniform changes, the job changes, the attention changes, but the work remains connected to the same craft: pitching, teaching it, watching young arms try to figure out the same cruel equation of talent, command, role, health, timing, and opportunity. For Davis, that path feels appropriate. His own career had required reinvention. He knew what it meant to be viewed one way and then asked to become another. He knew what it meant to be a young pitcher, a struggling starter, a reliever, a closer, a star, and then a veteran trying to stay useful. That is a lot of baseball knowledge, even if it does not all show up in the back of a baseball card. The source record says Davis lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, with his wife, Candy. They have 2 sons and 2 daughters. A quiet detail, but a good one to end near, because it pulls the story back down from awards and contracts and voting percentages. The public career becomes a private life. The closer who once owned the 9th inning becomes, like so many players from that era, a name you might see on an old card and suddenly remember more vividly than expected. That is the emotional center of Mark Davis's story. If you watched him in 1989, you did not imagine that season would become the high point so completely. You saw a dominant closer in his prime. You saw a pitcher who had found the right job. You saw a man whose career seemed to be opening into something bigger. And in one sense, it did. He won the Cy Young. He reached an honor most pitchers never approach. He forced baseball to recognize the value of a reliever in the highest leverage moments of a season. But in another sense, that same season became almost impossible to repeat. That is the hard truth beneath the nostalgia.
Baseball gives players windows, and sometimes those windows are smaller than anyone realizes. A few years in the right bullpen, a role that fits, a manager's trust, a body that responds, a league that has not yet fully adjusted, a season where every inherited runner stays where he is supposed to stay. Then the window moves, and the player is left trying to follow it. Mark Davis deserves to be remembered because the peak was real, not imagined, not inflated by memory. Real enough to lead the league in saves, real enough to finish 6th in MVP voting, real enough to win the National League Cy Young Award, real enough that no National League closer would do it again for 14 years. He also deserves to be remembered because the rest of the career was real too. The losses as a starter were real, the trades were real, the contract was real, the loss of the closer role was real. The releases, the returns, the final innings, the coaching years, all of it belongs to the same baseball life. That is what makes the story more meaningful than a simple "what happened to him" question.
What happened to Mark Davis is what happens, in different forms, all over baseball. A player finds the exact version of himself that works, and for a while, it is beautiful. Then the league changes, or the role changes, or the results change, and the same talent no longer produces the same certainty. The distance between greatness and memory can be very short. Sometimes it is one season, sometimes it is one contract, sometimes it is the 9th inning, where a man can become unforgettable and then spend years proving he still belongs after the game has stopped seeing him that way. Mark Davis was not a failed star. He was a pitcher who reached the top of a hard profession, briefly held a place very few relievers have ever held, and then lived the rest of a long baseball career in the shadow of his best summer. And maybe that is the lesson. In baseball, timing can make a career look destined, and time can make that same career look almost forgotten. But for 1 year in San Diego, when Mark Davis took the ball, the game narrowed, the noise changed, and greatness was close enough to touch.